Hi everyone, and it's really great to be able to welcome you all tonight to tonight's webinar, The 5 Secrets of Persuasion and Influence. It's really good to see that so many of you have signed up to understand this powerful method of communication. And I'm hoping that over the next 45 minutes or so, to not only dispel some myths about persuasion, but also to give you some great ideas to mull over, practice, and hopefully benefit from. Persuasion techniques, as a rule, tend to be shrouded in mystery, mainly because they operate below our consciousness. And some people dramatically describe them as a mystic art, a magic, rather than a technique. And this tends to indicate, like any great art form, you need to be a great artist to be able to do it. You need to be probably born with the skill or the talent. It can't be learned, can it? The good news is that once you understand the techniques, you can operate then in the same unconscious area as the great professional, excellent persuaders. And some people feel that persuasion techniques are, well, they're manipulative, controlling, something to be avoided, especially as some techniques operate beneath the consciousness and the awareness. And although they can be used for good, well, sometimes probably not so good, and sometimes even for evil. You think about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the World War II. What an incredible persuader that guy was to influence a whole nation to do what they did in the Second World War. But I'm here to tell you that long-term benefits can only be gained from operating on the win-win principle. So let's go through today's agenda. We're going to look at the top mistakes that many people make when they're trying to persuade, including some of the myths about persuasion that even today are believed to be true. Secondly, we'll investigate our own thought processes and considering our mindsets before we even start the persuasion process. Are we truly believing that we can get the desired result? Or are we just setting ourselves up to fail right from the onset? And if we're going to be successful persuaders, we need to appreciate how we and other people make our daily decisions. And I think this section may be a big surprise to many people. I'm sure we've all heard that a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, this section will highlight the importance of using the right words. Bearing in mind that in a hypnosis, we can just by using words change the conscious state of any individual. We don't anymore need a swinging watch to get people into a trance. And then we'll finish up by looking at how to bring the whole thing to a close by getting the results that we want and persuading people to a course of action that we want them to take. First of all, let's start to look at the dictionary definition of persuasion and influencing. What actually is persuasion and influence according to the dictionary? Well, persuasion is a process, there's an interesting word to start off with, process aimed at changing a person or people's attitude or behavior towards an event or an idea, an object, or other people. And they do this by using the written or spoken words. And this conveys information, feelings, or reasoning, or a combination of all of those. Influence is the capacity to have an effect on a character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. The good news is nothing there states that it's a mystic art or magic. Nothing there that tells you these aren't learnable techniques and processes. If you think about it, we've all actually started our persuasion careers very early on, negotiating, shall I say, which breakfast cereal we want in the morning, or how to avoid school on certain days, and when can we go out to play rather than do that horrible homework. And as kids, we were all brilliant persuaders, full of confidence, no inhibitions. And if it all failed, we could throw ourselves on the floor and have a paddy. Not quite so easy to do that in a boardroom, perhaps. So we probably do need to learn these techniques. There's a bit more subtle to move us forward. On the reverse side of us being children negotiators, as parents, to be a good persuader is invaluable. Our ability, I suppose, to persuade our children to do the right thing and possibly resist other persuasion techniques from other, well, let's say, less reliable sources could save us a whole load of heartache in the future. So, looking back over that, it's all a persuasion, a process. It's not an art. And if you start to think about when we first started to break down the persuasion process, you've got to go back something like 2,500 years. And this guy here, Aristotle, what this philosopher, this Greek philosopher and scientist did was he started to look at the persuasion process and break it down to understand what it was. And although a lot of time has gone by since then, many of the things that he identified are still relevant today. And we'll explain what that is as we go through the course of this presentation. So in terms of persuasion and influence with a modern day approach, it's all about the latest techniques. Neuroscience has moved on dramatically because of the intensive research that's been done, because of fMRI scans and our ability to look at the brain as it's making decisions, look at the brain as it's doing various functions. And because of that, we've been able to develop tried and tested keys of persuasion, some of which I'm going to talk to you about today. The good news about these keys are they operate beneath the consciousness. And the other good thing about these keys are they're only known by about 1% of the population. Only 1% know them and use them. So if you actually learn these techniques and more importantly, take action and use these techniques, you'll be in the top 1% of persuaders. That will give you an incredible edge going forward. So persuasion, as we've said already, is a technique rather than an art. And like any technique, whether you're learning to ride a bike or juggling or whatever that technique is, the more you practice it, the better you become at it. It doesn't mean to say you'll get it right first time, but you've got to have persistence and stick with it. And once you've done that, you can use it on a regular basis and make persuasion a habit that gets you on a continual basis what you want out of life. So here's some myths of persuasion. Let's start to think about what has persuasion been in the past? What do people still think about that? And this guy here, you may not know his name, James Vickery, or recognize his face, but what this guy came up with in the 1950s was a process of persuasion that was incredibly scary, because what he said was he could persuade people to do something without them even knowing it. And at the time, it was described as the most frightening thing since the atom bomb. In fact, the CIA, MI5, and many authorities were all over this, thinking if we could master this technique that Vickery's outlining, people would be doing what we want them to do, and they wouldn't even know that we've got them to do it. You've probably guessed already that what Vickery came up with in the 1950s was something called subliminal persuasion or subliminal advertising. And in New Jersey, while showing a film over a 6-week period to some 45,000 people, this film, The Picnic, had images flashed on screen for less than 3,000ths of a second. And these images weren't noticed by the conscious mind, only the unconscious picked them up. And as a result, what Vickery was able to do was influence the sales of Coca-Cola and popcorn, because the pictures showed these in a favorable light. And what he said was, as a result of flashing these images on screen that they didn't consciously see, Coca-Cola increased sales by 18% and an incredible 58% increase of sales of popcorn. What an incredible achievement. What an incredible skill to be able to persuade people without them even knowing it. Interestingly enough, CIA and the MI5, nobody's been able to replicate what Vickery achieved in that 1950 cinema theatre. The other interesting thing is, just before he died in 1977, Vickery actually said, well, actually, I didn't actually do it. I just said I had to further my career and develop my business. And what that really tells us is persuasion is no shortcut. There's no easy way to just, without anybody knowing it, flash images on screen and persuade them to do something. Even despite that, it's still banned in this country, which is an interesting phenomenon. I love this saying by Abraham Maslow. He says, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if somebody's as good at DIY as I am, you can probably understand this. If you've got a screw that needs screwing in and you haven't got to screw it up, well, a hammer can do that, can't it? I haven't got a chisel, but surely the hammer can do it. I'm really good with the hammer. And persuasion is a bit like that because you've got a technique that works some of the time, so you keep using it. And perhaps the way your boss persuades you to do something, well, actually, I can use that same technique on other people. And the interesting thing is you can't, because we're all different, and persuasion is a very flexible animal that needs to be adapted to the person that you're actually trying to persuade. And unless you do so, it's not going to work. So going back to Aristotle, what Aristotle came up with was three elements. He said was you break persuasion and influencing down, you come up with ethos, pathos, and logos. That's all Greek to me. I'm sure it is to you as well. But let's break it down into the modern day idiom, because ethos refers to the person that's doing the persuading. How credible are they? What type of personality have they got? Have they got a reputation that backs up what they're trying to say? Are they perceived as being an expert? And do they have the charisma and trust to carry through the process? In modern days, we call it the authority key. Because if you've got the authority, the more of an expert you are, the more believable you are, the more likely people are to listen to what you're saying and be influenced by the words you're using. Pathos, on the other hand, refers to actually the person that you're trying to persuade, the audience that you're trying to persuade. And in particular, their psychological and emotional state. Interesting thing is that somebody in a negative frame of mind, somebody who's in a bad mood, will think differently about a persuasion process than they would in a good mood or a positive frame of mind. So what we need to do is, by listening to what they say, determine what is their current state. And really more importantly than that, what's their desired state? Because if we can show them our persuasion process will move them from where they are now to where they want to be, we'll have what I call internal momentum. And the intrinsic motivation they generate themselves will carry the day. The modern day key that we use to get this is the rapport key, because if you're on the same wavelength as somebody, speaking the same language, understanding them totally, and they feel at ease with you, they're going to listen to what you have to say. If there's no rapport there, no matter how good your argument is, people won't be persuaded by you. Rapport is really the first stage of any influencing process. And that's why on the courses we teach how to get instant rapport and maintain that rapport throughout the whole process. And there is a great skill in that. The final thing that Aristotle came up with was the logos. Logos refers to the actual message itself, the persuasion that you're trying to put across, the substance of your message. And he actually said that we're all fundamentally reasonable people, making decisions that make sense. The modern day key we use is the reason why key. What is the reason why they should do what you want them to do? Does it make sense to them? Doesn't matter about if it makes sense to you or the guy down the road. It's got to make sense to them. And they've got to see what the benefit is to them. So what mistakes do people make when they try to persuade somebody to do something? And we all fall into these sometimes. What are the key areas that we make mistakes in? Well, the first one is not being natural. Because when we're trying to persuade somebody, nobody wants to feel that they're being manipulated. Nobody wants to feel they're actually being persuaded. And quite often in a persuasion situation, what we tend to do is we adopt a different persona and we become probably more official. We start to sound false. And as a result of that, insincere. And I call this the CP30 syndrome. We start to sound like a robot. I've seen this so many times with salespeople, very natural. And then the minute they stand in front of a customer or pick a phone up and talk to a customer, they sound like a completely different person. It's almost as if they're reading a script, even if they're not. And people will be alerted to that straight away and start to be more conscious about the persuasion process and start to resist much more than they would do if they weren't in that position. The next biggest mistake people make is failing to actively listen. And I make a distinction there. Actively listening is different to hearing. And it is probably one of the most valuable tools that you have. If you don't listen, you won't know where they are now. And pathos is all about understanding the psychological and emotional state that they're in at the moment and where they want to be, their desired state. So without that knowledge, you can't change the approach that you use, and you won't know the correct words that you need to use. So thinking about that active listening process, the first thing you need to do is realize that as an active listener, it's different to hearing. And we all think that we're a good listener. I'm a good listener. Actually, challenge yourself. Are you really a good listener? Because most of the time, people have shown that 45% of the time we're listening to somebody, we're actually thinking about what we're going to say next. And another 45% of the time, we're waiting for a gap so we can say what we want to say next. That only leaves 10% for actively listening. So think about this. When you're listening to somebody, do you think about other things while you're keeping track of the conversation? A lot of people do. Do you listen with the intent to reply rather than with the intent to understand? Because understanding is the key element. Or do you break in with your own ideas before the other person's finished talking? Some people listen primarily for the facts rather than the ideas. And some people, when they're listening, their thoughts tend to turn to other things, especially if you believe the person you're listening to has got nothing of particular of interest to say to you, or it doesn't fit in with what you wanted them to say. And otherwise, it's very easy to be distracted by outside sights and sounds, things that are going on around you or inside your own head even. And a lot of people show that they're not listening by actually finishing what the other person's saying. It's very easy to jump in and finish this, just to move it along a little bit quicker. So what you probably need to do is when you're in that persuasion process is really switch off hearing, switch on active listening. Face the person you're going to try to be persuading. Look at the body language. It's critical. Maintain eye contact. Try to minimize those external and internal distractions and also focus on what the other person is actually saying. They're the most important person on the planet at that particular moment in time. And don't forget to respond appropriately. So it might be just a nod or a mm-hmm. And most importantly, as you'll see later on, keeping an open mind is critical because we need to go in with their perspective and we don't know what that is. We can second guess it, but we'll probably get it wrong. Finally, the right words are critical. And as many of the right words are there's lots of wrong words to use. One of the big words that we use, which is wrong, is the but word. And but is like, if you're on a computer, it's like hitting the delete key. So if you say, I understand what you're saying, but I feel, the minute you say but, it's like you've just deleted everything you've said prior to the but. And what the other person's thinking is, as soon as you say but, is they don't understand at all. They're no longer listening to what you're saying. They're trying to think of another way of putting across what they feel or think so that you do understand it. So instead of saying, I understand what you feel, but say, I understand what you're saying, however, another way of looking at it. And that will give you far more of an opportunity to get across what your thoughts are. Let's think about our mindset on this as well. In terms of our mindset, many people fail in the persuasion process before they even start. Salespeople fail often before they even start. And I know you've seen this quote many, many times from Henry Ford. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Yes, you've seen it. And yes, you're consciously aware of it. But are you unconsciously aware before you start the persuasion process of what you're thinking? Because most people aren't thinking about what they're thinking about. It's a thing that you need to bring to the conscious awareness. Do you know what you're thinking? In modern day terms, Stephen Richards has come up with another saying. He says reality is a projection of your thoughts or the things you habitually think about. So your reality is generated by you, by the things you're thinking about. Your outcomes are generated by what you're thinking about. And again, in NLP, we say, think about what you're thinking about. Because if you think about what you're thinking about, you can change it. Anything that you start to look at and focus on can be changed. But these two facts, these two quotes are very relevant most of the time in a negative way because we're not thinking about them. We've not brought them to our conscious awareness. See this many times with salespeople is they're about to make sales calls, whether they're face-to-face or on the phone. And to the extent they almost become frightened of the phone, they're frightened to pick it up because internally, without analysing it, they think about all the things that have gone wrong in the past, or the objections that have come, and the fact that there's some flaws in their sales pitch that might cause resistance. And what they tend to do, because of this negative feeling that's starting to arise, is they tend to put off making those calls. They shuffle paper around, or they'll go and make a cup of coffee, or they'll talk to the guy across the other side of the room, simply because nobody likes rejection. We all hate it, and we try to do anything to avoid it. But if you've got the right positive outcome in mind, you're more likely to get the right results. The negative focus, bearing in mind you always get what you focus on, will result in you looking for the negatives. Because both negatives and positives are there all the time. But if you're focusing on the negative, you'll find those. And what that tends to do is bring up the resistance. You're actually looking for resistance because of your unconscious thought process. And because you're looking for resistance, just like the openings and opportunities are there, so is the resistance. And if you find that, what that tends to do is means I knew this was coming, and you abandon your objective before you pursue it further. So instead of looking for the opportunities, unconsciously, you're looking for the resistance. And what we do is quite often, because we've got lack of flexibility, quite often we know where we want to go. And we've got a route in our mind as to how to get there. And if that route is blocked in any way, we think we can't get to where we want to go. And that's why keeping an open mind is incredibly powerful, because if we know where we want to go, but it doesn't matter how we get there, we're going to be far more flexible and far more open to the other person's will. Because at the end of the day, surely it's the result that matters. How we get there is irrelevant. And be aware of that focus all the time. Quite often we think unconsciously about the negative results. How about consciously think about, this is where I want to go? Even write it down. It's much more powerful. There's a connection that's made when you write things down that's very, very powerful. We don't think like computers. We're human beings. The mind works in a strange way in terms of there's two parts of the mind, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And just like this picture of the iceberg, 10% of the iceberg is above the water, you can see it. 90% of the iceberg is beneath the water, you can't see it. That's the most dangerous, it sinks ships. Our unconscious mind is just the same. It's the most powerful part of your brain. The conscious mind you are aware of. You can hear what you're saying, hear what you're thinking. But the unconscious mind, 90% you can't see, you can't hear. You don't, unless you look for it, it's not a awareness to you. And yet that's the part that sinks what you're trying to achieve. You can use both methods in persuasion, both conscious and unconscious. In the unconscious path, both you and the person that you're persuading are making an active or a conscious attempt to understand and define and process the argument. And a person who's interested in your persuasive attempts, well, they'll be probably highly motivated to listen to you. They'll also be able to consciously evaluate your message and carefully then weigh up the pros and cons and the evidence that you present. It's very hard when somebody's conscious like that to justify every element of what you're trying to do. Where you need to be most of the time is in the unconscious side of things, because the unconscious path, the person you're trying to persuade is spending probably little or no time processing what you're saying, the information you're giving them. It's all about the approach. And this results in those automatic triggers that we talked about earlier, the knee-jerk reactions, if you like, that happen when you follow your intuition or when you take those mental shortcuts. And your mind then reaches a decision without doing the logical processing. So these unconscious decisions are largely driven by the intrinsic emotion. So people use their instinct or emotion instead of their intellect to passively process the automatic decision triggers in their decision making. The key is knowing which mode you're in, which mode are they in, and then using the appropriate method. As I said, we're not computers. There's not Intel inside. The people we're persuading aren't computers. It's not all about fact and logic. It's all about emotion. Let's think about that. Let's think about how the brain works. And the good news is, with all the neuroscientists now spending all those hours and years researching, with fMRI scans able to tell us what we're doing, even when we're sleeping, even when we're making decisions. It's much more known about the brain now and how we can use those elements. Let's split the brain into three very distinct parts. First of all, we've got the oldest part of the brain, the reptilian brain. And that's really the fight or flee response. That's really the survival instinct. It's about body functions, breathing, swallowing, your heartbeat, and all those elements. As it evolves, the more modern part of the brain is the limbic brain, and more emerged in mammals. And it's got the emotions and the hippocampus and memory all involved in here, feelings, relationships. The very human part of the brain is the neocortex, evolved through primates, but it does play a massive part in things like language and abstract thought, imagination. And the reason why we thought we were top of the food chain is because our prefrontal cortex, part of the neocortex, is far bigger than any other mammal. And that's where the fact and logic center is of the brain. And we thought that's why we're top of the food chain, that's why we're top of our game, is because we are very much fact and logic driven. Interesting thought. Because when we started to look at this in more detail, those three elements didn't behave the way we thought on fMRI scans. What happened was scientists discovered most of the time, 90% of the time they determined, our brains are actually in neutral. There's no real thought process going on. We're just using the reptilian instinct part of the brain and reacting. Other than that, 95% of our decision making is unconscious. Again, that neutrality of the brain is still in there. And in actual fact, when they actually did the fMRI scans to find out how the brain reacted in decision making, we thought, because we're top of the food chain, because we're very much fact and logic driven, the part of the brain that would light up when we made decisions would be the prefrontal cortex. So you can imagine how shocked the neuroscientists were when they find out actually it was a part of the brain in the limbic section called the amygdala, about the size of a walnut, top of the spinal column, bottom of the brain. The amygdala made the decisions because that's the part of the brain that lit up first. And that part of the brain is responsible for feelings and emotions. Only later, after the amygdala had lit up, did the prefrontal cortex kick in to rationalize what our decisions were. So if our decisions are very much emotion and feeling, that's where our language should be targeted. That's where our persuasion process must start. Let's think about how we can affect that emotion in the persuasion process. How can we utilize something that causes cognitive dissonance? Well, let's think about the consistency key. The consistency key is people are more inclined to believe and follow others that are consistent in their behavior. And the opposite, if they're inconsistent, is also true. Because the person who's inconsistent, whose beliefs and actions and words don't consistently match up, that tends to cause mistrust and confusion. And again, brings them into a conscious awareness where they start to analyze the pros and cons much more because they've been alerted that something's not quite right. The guy who formulated this theory was a guy called Leon Festinger in 1957. And he posed that we all try to be consistent with our beliefs and attitudes, and that if at any time there's some conflict between what our beliefs were, our attitudes, our behaviors, or our actions even, then this would cause an internal stress, a state of tension, if you like. And it's that state of tension, that stress, that is what cognitive dissonance really is. And what he determined was we'd often alter or reduce or eliminate the attitudes, beliefs, or the behaviors in an attempt to reduce the discomfort, i.e., cognitive dissonance. Because what we were trying to do was restore balance. So what we need to do in the persuasion process is we need to ask questions that establish what the other person's beliefs are, what their attitudes, and then align them with our proposal. Knowing that and not to go along with the proposal will cause cognitive dissonance. So in other words, align the benefits with what you're proposing and elicit from them the value that we'd obviously give to them if they were to go along with that proposal. Also try to elicit at that stage how important and urgent they want those results, because that can move the process along much quicker as well. This also, with this, if you think about how you can use this, it also allows the foot in the door technique to actually take it. Because once somebody's committed to something, even in a small way, you can get them to expand on that. There's a great piece of research done in 1966 by researchers. And what they did is they got this guy to go around an area or a neighborhood in California, asking the people living there if they'd allow a very large billboard to be put up in their garden. And on the billboard, it said, "Drive carefully." And he wanted it put on their front lawns. And so they'd have an idea what it looked like. He showed them a picture where it was in another area. And they saw in this picture a very large sign saying, "Drive carefully," obstructing the view of a very beautiful house. Not surprisingly, quite a few people turned them down. In fact, most of the people said no. Although in one area, 76% of the people who were shown the sign agreed to do it. And the reason why is because a couple of weeks earlier, another researcher had gone round and asked them to put a small square sign, 3 inches by 3 inches, in their window that said, "Be a safe driver." Now, since it was a small request, this one, nearly all of them agreed. And the reason, because it was such an outstanding result, is they'd actually agreed to put it in the window to start off with. And it influenced their willingness to comply with the much larger request, because if not, how would it sort of fit with their belief they were supporting good drivers? So if people say they want to do something, they support something, they're more likely to follow it through, because if they don't, what they've got to do is rewrite their belief of who they are, what their self-image is. So again, going back, we need to get the questions that elicit what the other person's beliefs and attitudes are and how they fit with where we're trying to take them to. So our persuasion process will have a much better chance of taking hold. When we think about the power of words and painting pictures of persuasion, we need to think about how we can use words in a powerful way. And Albert Moravian came up with some research I think it was in the 1970s. He came up with the research that said 93% of our communication is non-verbal. Now, the interesting thing about that is only 7% of our persuasion is actually the words that we use. And a lot of people think, well, that's not important then. Well, actually, they are very important. What Moravian was actually saying was, it's the incongruency that was important. In other words, if they didn't all mean the same, if the words didn't match the tone, if the tone and words didn't match the body language, people would believe the tone and the body language over the words. So if you're shaking your head saying, yes, I can do that, people would think you couldn't do it, even though your words were saying you could. So you need to make sure that all of your actions, your body language, the tone, the way you say it, matches the words that you're using. And then start to think about, with the pictures and images, we have the power of persuasion. Because our minds work in pictures and images. We think in pictures and images. So we need to put those pictures and images, descriptive words that put pictures and images in people's minds. You've heard the saying, I didn't believe it until I saw it. But we believe what we see. We believe it with our own eyes because it's the pictures and images that have got the most power. Research has shown that in 1986, visual aids were 43% more effective than just words themselves. And also that we process, in fact, 60,000 times faster processing text. So visuals are processed 60,000 times faster than text. And more importantly, they quickly affect our emotions. So we need to plant pictures in people's minds. And the words we use can do that. Think about the words you're going to do. Can you imagine how this would look on your drive? And people will start to imagine it. They can't stop you. And if I said to you, I don't want you to think about this now. Don't think about a blue elephant. I don't need to think about a blue elephant, so don't picture it. Well, immediately, even before I put the image up on screen there, you'd put a picture in your mind, even if it's to eliminate it, delete it straight away. The image was there. You can't stop people putting pictures in your mind. So think about your persuasion process. How can you put pictures? How can you get people to imagine and move you forward? Dale Carnegie came up with this great saying. He said, there is only one way to get anybody to do anything, and that's by making the other person want to do it. People only do what they want to do. But you've got to get them to have that intrinsic motivation that comes from inside because they want to, because it moves them closer to where they want to be. There's a great saying here. Before you start any process, know what you want before you even start it. There's a great book called 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, written by a guy called Stephen Covey. And what Stephen Covey saw was some people were really successful, they really got what they wanted out of life, and other people weren't. And he thought, well, why are these people so successful? What do they do? So he started to look at them and break down their habits, if you like. And he found out they were doing several things that they all had in common, 7 habits, in fact. And one of the most powerful habits he came out with was know what you want before you start. He called it start with the end in mind. Because what you focus on is what you get. And if you're focusing on a successful outcome, you'll see the way forward. You see what you need to do. In NLP, there's a great analogy that says that the brain can only process 134 bits of information every second. And yet, the 5 senses are generating 2 million bits of information every second of every day. So there's a hell of a lot that's deleted and distorted, cut out straight away that we're just not aware of. What we need to do, if we know what we're looking for, the 134 bits that the brain processes were the bits that lead us to where we want to go. And also, we mentioned earlier, we're looking for a win-win scenario, but what we've got to be is very flexible as to how we get there. Because the route there is irrelevant, it's the end result that's important. And sometimes we have to go with the other person's view, the other person's route, because it's more comfortable for them. And that's the end result that we want, still the win-win scenario. We can create positive anchors as well. Positive anchors are some things that, remember Pablo's dog. We gave him a piece of meat, rang a bell, and the dog salivated. Did that on several occasions. Eventually, didn't need the meat, just rang the bell, and the dog salivated. But we've all got anchors that lead us to results, anchors that are shortcuts for our minds. So what are the anchors that you can put in place in your persuasion process that gives your person you're persuading good feelings? You need to listen to what they have to say, and you can determine what those are. It's a great saying by Chris Dixon. He said, if you aren't getting rejected on a daily basis, then your goals aren't ambitious enough. And that turns it on its head, because quite often salespeople in particular hate being rejected. It's like a point of failure to them. But if you think of it like this, and it's all about rephrasing it, reframing it. If you're getting rejected, that's good, isn't it? Because that means your goals are big enough and you are going to get to where you want to go. None of this is any good unless you take action. And the chances of your success without taking action are pretty minimal. One of my heroes, Tony Robbins, he actually said the path to success is to take massive, determined action. What massive, determined action are you going to take now? Now you know the processes and the techniques of persuasion. Remember, to be successful, to say I did and I am and I can, I think I can, are more powerful than saying I won't, I can't, I don't know, I wish I could, I want to. So deciding to do something is not the answer. Doing it is the answer. I hope this has been useful for you over the last sort of 45 minutes or so. I'm going to put this on the website and on YouTube. So please feel free to visit the site. I'm going to send you the email link, and also to be on my website as well. And please feel free to contact me. There's my telephone number, my email address, and the website details on there. We use NLP style telesales training, sales training, customer service training, leadership and management training, as well as NLP coaching, one-to-one and one-to-many. So please feel free to ring me up, ask me any questions. It'd be nice to talk to you, and thanks very much for listening to us.